I never imagined that opening my home to family would lead to a battle over control, respect, and boundaries. Yet, here I am, standing in my own living room, feeling like a stranger in what is supposed to be my safe haven. I live in a charming town in northern France, where cobblestone streets wind through centuries-old buildings, and the scent of fresh bread drifts from the boulangeries each morning. My home, a modest but cozy apartment near the town square, had always been my sanctuary. That was before my mother, Catherine, and her husband, Henry, moved in. Catherine had married Henry 5 years ago. He was a man of stern expressions and traditional beliefs, the kind who believed that respect was owed to him simply by virtue of his presence. They had been doing well enough until Henry lost his job, and soon after, their house was foreclosed. With nowhere else to go, they turned to me. I didn't hesitate to take them in. After all, they were family, and family helped each other. But what I hadn't anticipated was how quickly Henry would forget that this was my home, not his. At first, things were manageable. They settled into the guest room, and I tried my best to make them comfortable. But within the first few weeks, small comments started slipping into our conversations. "Anna, don't you think your dress is a little too revealing?" Henry remarked one evening as I got ready to meet some friends. I laughed it off, assuming it was a misplaced attempt at fatherly concern, though it stung. "Henry, I'm 27. I think I can decide what to wear." His lips pressed together in disapproval, but he said nothing more that night. Unfortunately, it didn't stop there. The remarks became more frequent. Skirts were too short, tops were too tight, lipstick was too bold. Each comment felt like a needle pricking at my independence, and no matter how many times I told him to stop, he always found a way to slip in another remark. My mother, caught between us, would only sigh. "You know how he is, Anna. Just ignore it." But I couldn't. How do you ignore someone who believes they have the right to dictate your choices in your own home? One evening, my boyfriend, Lucas, came over for dinner. Henry had never liked Lucas, perhaps, because he wasn't the quiet, obedient type Henry seemed to respect. Lucas and I had been together for 2 years, and he understood my frustrations with Henry. Still, he tried to keep the peace for my sake. That night, we ate, drank, and enjoyed the evening. Lucas stayed until around 10:30, at which point he kissed me goodnight and left. I had just finished washing the dishes when Henry stormed into the kitchen. "This is unacceptable," he snapped, his face red with anger. "We don't stand for this in our house." I froze. "Excuse me? Having a man over this late, being alone in your room with him, it's inappropriate." I put the dish towel down, my patience finally snapping. "Henry, let me be very clear. This is my house, not ours. You don't get to tell me how to live." His nostrils flared. "You may own this apartment, but as long as we live here, I expect some respect." I clenched my fists, trying to keep my voice steady. "Respect is a two-way street, Henry, and so far you've done nothing but try to control me." That night, I barely slept. The anger simmered beneath my skin, and for the first time since they had moved in, I questioned whether I had made a mistake. The next morning, over coffee, I laid down the new rules. "From now on," I began, "you will respect my boundaries. No more comments about my clothing. No more interference in my personal life. And since you seem to believe you have a say in how this household is run, you will start paying rent." Henry's face darkened. "You're charging us to live here?" "Yes, €400 a month. It's a fair price considering you pay nothing for utilities. And I buy most of the groceries." My mother gasped. "Anna, is this really necessary?" "Yes, it is," I said firmly. "Henry acts like this is his house. Maybe paying rent will remind him that it isn't." Henry's silence spoke volumes. He stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. I took a shaky breath, feeling the weight of my decision. But for the first time since they moved in, I felt like I was taking back control. This was just the beginning. I knew there would be consequences, but I was ready for them, because this was my home, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me. Days passed, and the atmosphere in the apartment grew heavier with each one. Henry, who was once all too eager to impose his beliefs on me, had gone quiet. Not that I minded, I welcomed the silence. But there was an underlying tension that I couldn't ignore. My mother, ever the peacemaker, tried to smooth things over. "He's just adjusting," she told me over tea one evening. "You have to understand, he's never had to live by someone else's rules before." I sighed. stirring my tea absent-mindedly. That's the problem, Mom. He thinks he's the head of this house, but he's not. She gave me a sad smile. He's stubborn, but he means well. I wasn't so sure. At first, Henry begrudgingly accepted the new arrangement. He paid the rent grudgingly, but he paid. The passive-aggressive sighs and cold shoulders were his primary weapons now, but I could handle those. Then one evening, as I was preparing dinner, Henry walked into the kitchen and leaned against the counter. "You know, Anna," he said casually, "I've been thinking, maybe I should be involved in some of the decisions around here." I arched an eyebrow. Decisions? Well, household rules for one. If we're paying rent, don't you think we should have some say in how things are run? I put my knife down, turning to face him fully. No, paying rent doesn't give you authority here, Henry. It just means you're contributing to expenses. This is still my home. His jaw tightened. That doesn't seem fair. I crossed my arms. Life isn't always fair. That night, I could feel the storm brewing. Henry wasn't going to accept this arrangement quietly. And sure enough, the next day, he made his next move. The shift was subtle at first. Small things, like rearranging items in the kitchen, dictating when windows should be opened, and even making decisions about grocery shopping without consulting me. Henry was testing me, seeing how far he could push. I ignored it at first. After all, they were my guests, and I didn't want to create more tension. But the small intrusions quickly turned into something bigger. One evening, I came home after a long day at work, exhausted and looking forward to nothing more than a quiet dinner. But as I stepped into my apartment, something felt off. The furniture in the living room had been completely rearranged. My cozy armchair, which I always kept near the window, was shoved into a corner. My bookshelf was moved to the opposite wall. Even the coffee table had been swapped for an old wooden one that wasn't mine. I stared at the scene in disbelief before turning toward the kitchen, where Henry stood, sipping a glass of wine like he hadn't just redecorated my entire home. "What the hell is this?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Henry set his glass down and folded his arms across his chest. "I thought the layout was inefficient. It needed a change." I felt my blood pressure spike. "You thought? Henry, this is my home. You don't get to decide how it's arranged." He shrugged, completely unfazed. "We live here too, Anna. It makes sense for us to have a say." I clenched my fists. "No, Henry, you don't live here. You are staying here because I let you. That does not give you the right to change anything." My mother, who had been sitting at the dining table, finally spoke up. "Anna, don't make a big deal out of this. He was just trying to help." I turned to her, my frustration only growing. "Mom, this isn't about helping. This is about respect. He's acting like this is his house, and it's not," Henry scoffed. "You're overreacting." I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. Put everything back the way it was. Now. He stared at me for a long moment before sighing dramatically and turning away. "Fine. If it's that important to you." It was a small victory, but it didn't feel like one, because I knew this wasn't over. Henry's behavior didn't stop there. If anything, being forced to undo his changes seemed to fuel his determination. Over the next few days, I noticed more signs that he was trying to assert dominance. He began dictating household schedules, claiming that the laundry should be done on certain days, or that I should be more efficient with my grocery shopping. He even went as far as to tell me that I should start meal prepping on Sundays, so that we all could have access to organized meals throughout the week. I barely held my patience together. "Henry, the first don't prepare meals for you. You're lucky I let you use my kitchen at all." He grumbled under his breath, but didn't push further, at least, not in that moment. But things came to a head one night when Lucas stayed over late again. It wasn't even midnight when he left, but as soon as the door shut behind him, Henry emerged from the hallway, his face like thunder. "This isn't appropriate," he snapped. I threw my hands up. "Again with this? Henry, the first I'm a grown woman. Lucas is my boyfriend. You do not get to dictate who I see or when I see them." He shook his head, his lips pressed into a thin line. "This isn't just about you, Anna. Your choices affect this household. I won't allow this kind of behavior." I felt something inside me snap. "Allow? Henry, the first don't need your permission for anything." "You should have more respect for your mother," he shot back. My mother, who had been watching silently, sighed. "Anna, can't you just be considerate? He's only asking for some decency in the house." I stared at her, unable to believe what I was hearing. Mom, I have bent over backward to accommodate you both. I opened my home to you. I didn't have to. And instead of being grateful, Henry has done nothing but try to control me. Henry scoffed. You're just being dramatic. I took a deep breath. No, I'm done. If you have a problem with how I live my life, then you can leave. Silence. Henry's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. My mother looked between us, clearly torn. I turned to her, my voice softer now. Mom, I love you, but this isn't working. Either Henry respects my boundaries, or you both need to find somewhere else to stay. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she nodded slowly. I understand. Henry, on the other hand, looked livid. He stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. I had hoped that my ultimatum would finally make Henry back down, but I underestimated how stubborn he was. The next morning, I woke up to find a note on the kitchen table, written in Henry's sharp handwriting. Since you don't respect the people who live here, we'll be making other arrangements. You'll regret this. I stared at the words, my emotions a mess of relief and anger. Regret? No. I would never regret standing up for myself. When I came home from work later that evening, they were gone. The guest room was empty, their belongings packed up. For the first time in months, my apartment felt like mine again. I sank onto the couch, exhaling deeply. It was over. Over the next few weeks, I heard from my mother a few times. She had moved into a small apartment, and Henry had finally found another job. She never directly apologized for what had happened, but in her own way, she made it clear that she regretted how things had turned out. Henry, on the other hand, refused to speak to me, and that was fine by me. Lucas and I celebrated the return of my peace with a quiet dinner at home. As I looked around my living room back to the way I wanted it, I realized just how much I had allowed someone else to take control of my life. Never again. This was my home, and I had finally reclaimed it. The day Henry and my mother left, my apartment felt eerily quiet. Not the tense, suffocating silence that had filled the rooms before, but a peaceful, almost sacred kind of quiet. I took a deep breath, letting the weight of the past few months finally settle. They were gone. It was over. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to truly relax. I stretched out on my couch, listening to the gentle hum of the city outside my window. No more unsolicited comments about my clothing. No more territorial power plays over household decisions. No more controlling, condescending remarks disguised as concern. But as much as I felt relief, a strange emptiness also lingered. I wasn't sad they were gone, but the confrontation had drained me more than I realized. The first thing I did was reclaim my space. I spent the entire weekend undoing the changes Henry had made. I moved my favorite armchair back to its rightful place, reorganized my bookshelf, and got rid of the ugly coffee table he had brought in without my permission. Each adjustment felt like reclaiming a piece of my identity. But it wasn't just the physical changes that I had to undo. Mentally, I had been carrying so much resentment and exhaustion that it was hard to just let it go. I had spent months feeling like a prisoner in my own home, constantly walking on eggshells to avoid yet another argument. Lucas noticed. "You look lighter," he remarked one evening as we sat on my newly restored couch. I smiled, stirring my tea. "I feel lighter." He reached for my hand. "I knew you'd handle it, but I also know it wasn't easy." I sighed, squeezing his fingers. I didn't expect it to be this hard. I thought once they were gone, I'd feel nothing but relief. But there's still frustration. The way my mother let him treat me, the way he tried to control me. I can't just shake that off overnight. Lucas nodded, understanding. Healing takes time, but you did the right thing. I knew he was right. I had stood up for myself, and that mattered. But part of me still wondered if my mother truly understood what had happened. A week after they moved out, my mother called. I hesitated before answering. I wasn't sure what I expected: an apology, an explanation, a plea to reconsider. "Anna," she said softly, "how have you been?" I exhaled slowly. "Better, Mum. Just adjusting to having my home back." A long pause. "Then I wanted to thank you for letting us stay as long as you did." I frowned. "Mom, I didn't do it for Henry. The first did it for you." "I know," she admitted. "And I should have done more to stop him." For the first time, there was a crack in her voice. Guilt. Regret. "You should have," I agreed, my tone softer than I intended. "You let him treat me like I was a guest in my own home." "I didn't mean to," she said quietly. "I just wanted to keep the peace." I swallowed the lump in my throat. Keeping the peace shouldn't have come at my expense, Mum, she sighed. I see that now. We didn't talk much longer, but it was enough. She wasn't asking for forgiveness outright, but she was acknowledging the damage. And maybe, for now, that was enough. Henry, unsurprisingly, never reached out. If anything, I suspected he was still stewing in his own self-righteousness, convinced that I had been the problem. And that was fine by me. But the fallout from extended family was another story. Word spread quickly that I had kicked out my mother and her husband. Relatives I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly felt the need to weigh in. You should have been more understanding, my aunt messaged me one evening. Henry was only trying to help you. I rolled my eyes and replied, telling a grown woman what to wear and rearranging her home without permission isn't help. It's control. Her response was predictable. He's old-fashioned. You should have been more patient. I didn't reply. I was done justifying my boundaries to people who refused to respect them. Lucas saw the exchange and smirked. Next time, just send a picture of your apartment looking peaceful and caption it best decision I ever made. I laughed. Tempting. As weeks turned into a month, the tension that had once consumed my home slowly faded. I no longer braced myself before walking into my own kitchen, expecting some passive-aggressive remark. I no longer worried about what I was wearing when I left my bedroom. I was free. One Saturday, I decided to do something just for myself. I went to the market, bought a bouquet of my favorite flowers, and spent the afternoon baking. The simple pleasure of existing in my space, on my terms, felt like a quiet victory. Lucas came over that evening, inhaling the warm scent of cinnamon as he walked in. You look happy, he observed, wrapping an arm around my waist. I leaned into him, smiling. I am. And for the first time in a long while, I truly meant it. I hadn't expected to see Henry again, but life has a way of throwing surprises at you. One afternoon, while walking through town, I spotted him sitting alone at an outdoor cafe. For a moment, I considered walking past, pretending not to see him, but something in me refused to run. I approached. He looked up, surprised. Anna, Henry, the first greeted coolly. A long silence stretched between us before he sighed. I suppose you're still angry with me. I tilted my head. Not angry. Just done. His eyes narrowed. Done? Yes, I said simply. Done justifying why I deserved respect in my own home. Done being treated like a child in a space I built for myself. He scoffed. You always were stubborn. I shrugged. And you always assumed that meant I was wrong. His lips pressed together. He looked like he wanted to argue, but for the first time, he didn't. Instead, he nodded. Well, good luck then. I nodded back. You too. And with that, I walked away. Not because I needed to, but because I chose to. For the first time, I felt completely in control of my own story. The weight of the past few months had finally lifted, but that didn't mean the scars disappeared overnight. After Henry and my mother moved out, I spent a long time adjusting to my new reality. It was strange after fighting so hard to reclaim my home. I had to remind myself how to live in it again. The first few nights were eerily silent. I didn't have to brace myself before stepping into the living room, expecting an unwanted comment. I didn't have to feel the suffocating presence of someone who tried to take over my space. It should have been easy to let go, but the echoes of the past lingered. Lucas noticed. You still tense up sometimes, he observed as we sat in my kitchen, sipping coffee one morning. I sighed, tracing the rim of my mug. I guess part of me is still expecting him to walk in and criticize something. Lucas reached over and took my hand. He's not here anymore, and he doesn't get to live in your head either. I knew he was right. The physical battle was over, but the mental one was just beginning. I started small. Every day, I made little changes to reclaim my space. I lit candles in the evenings, something Henry had always scoffed at. I played my favorite music without worrying about whether it was appropriate for the house. I invited friends over again, turning my apartment back into the warm, welcoming place it had once been. One day, I bought a beautiful new rug for the living room, bright, colorful, and completely the opposite of Henry's drab taste. As I rolled it out, I couldn't help but laugh. It was such a small thing, but it felt like a declaration. This is my home. Lucas grinned as he watched me adjust it. You're enjoying this, aren't you? I smirked. More than I should. You deserve to. He was right. For the first time in a long time, I was prioritizing myself. and it felt damn good. A few weeks later, my mother called again. This time, she asked if she could come over. I hesitated. I wanted to see her, I missed her, but I wasn't ready for another round of justifications or excuses. Still, something in her voice told me this was different. "All right," I said. "Come by tomorrow." When she arrived, she looked different. Not just physically, but emotionally. There was a hesitance to her movements, like she wasn't sure if she was welcome. I took a deep breath. "Mom, come in." She stepped inside and looked around. Her eyes flickered to the bright new rug, the fresh flowers on the table, the way everything felt warm and lived in. "It looks nice in here," she said softly. "Thanks." She sat down at the kitchen table, fiddling with her hands. "I wanted to talk." I sat across from her, waiting. "I know I let you down," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I should have done more to stand up for you." Hearing her say it out loud was both validating and painful. "Yes," I agreed. "You should have." Tears welled in her eyes. "I was scared, Anna. I thought if I just kept the peace, everything would be okay. But I see now that I let Henry treat you terribly, and I didn't stop it." I swallowed hard. "Mom, I needed you to protect me, and you didn't." "I know." Her voice broke. "And I'm so sorry." For the first time, the weight I had been carrying shifted. She wasn't making excuses. She wasn't asking for forgiveness on Henry's behalf. She was taking responsibility, and that meant everything. I reached across the table and took her hand. "I don't know if things will ever be the same between us," I admitted. "But I appreciate you saying that." She nodded, wiping her tears. "I just want to do better." That was all I needed to hear. Of course, not everyone was as willing to move forward. The rest of my extended family had plenty to say about what had happened. My aunt sent me a particularly harsh message. "You pushed your own mother away. Do you really think that was worth it?" I took a deep breath before responding. I didn't push her away. I set boundaries. "If you can't see the difference, that's your problem, not mine." She never replied. It was exhausting, dealing with people who refused to see what had actually happened. But I had made peace with it. I didn't need their validation. I knew the truth. As time passed, I found myself feeling lighter. I threw a housewarming party not because I had moved, but because it felt like I was reclaiming my home all over again. Lucas helped me cook, teasing me when I got too serious about the decorations. "Anna, it's just a gathering, not a royal gala." I laughed. "I just want it to be perfect." "It already is," he said, kissing my forehead. And he was right. That night, surrounded by friends, I realized just how much had changed. My home was mine again. My life was mine again. And I had learned one of the most important lessons of all. Boundaries weren't just about keeping bad people out. They were about protecting the peace you worked so hard to build. Months had passed since I had taken back control of my home and my life. The transformation was not just in my surroundings, but within me. I had spent so much time fighting to reclaim my space that I hadn't realized I was also reclaiming myself. One evening, as I sat on my couch with a cup of tea, I reflected on the journey, the battles with Henry, the strain with my mother, the weight of extended family trying to make me feel like I was in the wrong. But despite all of it, I stood firm. I had fought for my right to peace, and I had won. The hardest part of healing wasn't getting rid of Henry, it was letting go of the resentment that had taken root in me. Anger had been my armor for so long, shielding me from the hurt of betrayal and disappointment. But now that I was free, I realized I didn't need that armor anymore. One day, while out for a walk, I found myself in front of a bookstore. On impulse, I walked inside. I browsed through the shelves, running my fingers over the spines of countless stories waiting to be read. That's when I saw a book on mindfulness and letting go of the past. I bought it without hesitation. That night, I read until the early hours, absorbing every word. It wasn't about forgetting what had happened. It was about freeing myself from the burden of carrying it. Holding on to my anger meant Henry still had power over me, and I was done giving him that. One afternoon, my phone rang. I glanced at the screen, my mother. I hesitated before answering. Things between us had been improving, but there was still a lingering tension, an unspoken understanding that we were both treading carefully. "Hi, Mom." "Hi, sweetheart," she said. "How are you?" "I'm good, really good." "And I meant it," she sighed, relief evident in her voice. "I'm glad. I wanted to tell you something." I waited. "I left him," she said quietly. I sat up straighter. "What?" "I left Henry." My mind raced. trying to process what she had just said. Mom, why? There was a long pause. Because I finally saw him for who he really is, and because I saw how much he hurt you. I should have stood up for you earlier, Anna. I see that now. Tears welled in my eyes. I had spent so long hoping she would see the truth, but I had given up expecting it. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, she whispered. Just know that I'm sorry, and that I want to fix things between us. I swallowed hard, emotions swirling inside me. I want that too. With Henry gone, my mother and I began the slow process of rebuilding our relationship. It wasn't perfect. Years of pain and disappointment didn't vanish overnight, but it was a start. We started meeting for lunch once a week. Sometimes we talked about the past. Other times we just enjoyed each other's company. There were still moments of hesitation, moments where the old wounds threatened to resurface, but we were working through them together. One day, she showed up at my apartment with a housewarming gift, an ornate mirror with a beautiful wooden frame. I saw this and thought of you, she said shyly. I ran my fingers over the carvings, touched by the gesture. Thank you, Mom, she smiled. It's time for a fresh start, don't you think? I nodded. Yeah, I think it is. As the months went on, I embraced my newfound peace. I focused on my career, my friendships, and my relationship with Lucas. He had been my rock through everything, and our bond was stronger than ever. One evening, as we cooked dinner together, he turned to me with a grin. So, when are we moving in together? I nearly dropped the spoon I was holding. What? He laughed. Come on, you know we've been talking about it for a while. You finally have your space back, and I want to be a part of it. A real part of it. I stared at him, my heart swelling. The idea of sharing my home with someone again had once terrified me, but with Lucas, it felt right. I took a deep breath, then smiled. Let's do it. The day Lucas officially moved in, I stood in the doorway of my apartment, watching as he brought in the last of his boxes. This place had been a battleground, a source of pain, but now it was something else entirely. It was home. I had fought to reclaim it, fought to reclaim myself, and now, standing there with the person I loved, I realized something. I had won. This wasn't just a victory over Henry. It was a victory over every doubt, every fear, every moment I had questioned my worth. I had built a life that was truly mine, surrounded by people who loved and respected me. Lucas wrapped his arms around me from behind. What are you thinking about? I leaned into him, smiling. Just how far I've come. He kissed the top of my head. And you're only getting started. He was right. This was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where I was in control, where my happiness wasn't dictated by anyone else. I turned to him, lacing my fingers with his. Let's make this place ours. And with that, we stepped inside, ready to build a future that was entirely our own.